Imagine waking up one seemingly ordinary July morning in medieval Europe. The summer heat is oppressive and life is hard, as it always is in the 16th century. You step outside your modest home in Strasbourg to see something that defies all explanation. Your neighbour dancing frantically in the street. Not the coordinated, joyful dancing of celebration, but wild, chaotic movements. Arms flailing, feet stomping, face contorted in what appears to be equal parts ecstasy and agony. You might assume they're drunk or perhaps they've gone mad, but then as the hours pass, this lone dancer is joined by another. And another. And another. Within days, dozens of people are dancing uncontrollably through the streets. They don't stop to eat, they don't stop to sleep. They just dance. Their feet bloody and raw, their bodies drenched in sweat, their eyes vacant. Yet still they dance. This isn't a scene from some bizarre horror film. This actually happened in the summer of 1518, in what is now eastern France. And before the mysterious epidemic subsided, up to 400 people had been afflicted, and dozens had literally danced themselves to death. Welcome to one of history's most bizarre medical mysteries, the dancing plague of 1518. Our strange tale begins with a single woman, known to history only as Fra Troffea. On a hot July day in 1518, in the Holy Roman Empire city of Strasbourg, now a part of France, Troffea stepped into the street and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no apparent reason whatsoever. Yet dance she did, for days on end. Within a week, 34 others had joined her manic ballet. By the end of the month, the number had swollen to approximately 400. The afflicted danced day and night, barely stopping to eat or rest. Many collapsed from exhaustion. Some suffered heart attacks or strokes. And yes, a significant number, possibly dozens, danced until they died. But what could possibly compel hundreds of people to dance themselves to death? Was it mass hysteria? Some unidentified toxin in their food? A bizarre cult ritual? Or perhaps something far more sinister? To understand this peculiar plague, we need to understand the world in which it erupted. The early 16th century was, to put it mildly, not the best time to be alive in Europe. The average person lived in conditions we would consider utterly unimaginable today. Strasbourg in 1518 was a powder keg of human suffering. The region had been devastated by a series of failed harvests, leading to severe famine. Contemporary accounts describe people so desperate they ate their domestic animals, and in some cases even resorted to consuming the flesh of executed criminals. Malnutrition was rampant, with many subsisting on nothing but bread made from desperately inferior grains. Disease was an ever-present shadow. The Black Death, which had wiped out up to 60% of Europe's population in the previous century, remained a constant threat. Outbreaks of smallpox, tuberculosis, and typhus regularly ravaged communities. Medical treatment was primitive at best, often doing more harm than good. Add to this the brutality of everyday life. Public executions were common entertainment. Violence was endemic. For the peasantry, work was backbreaking and relentless. The average person lived to around 35 years of age, if they were lucky. And if all of that wasn't enough, a relatively new disease had begun spreading rapidly through Europe. Syphilis. Particularly virulent in its early epidemic form, it caused horrific symptoms including facial deformity, madness, and eventual death. Some medical historians suggest this new terrifying illness added significantly to the psychological strain on the population. This was also a deeply superstitious time. Most people believed fervently in the literal existence of demons, witches, and divine punishment. The church held immense power over daily life, and many natural phenomena were interpreted as either miracles or curses sent directly from God or the devil. In short, the psychological pressure cooker of Strasbourg in 1518 was primed for an explosion. The Strasbourg incident wasn't actually the first recorded case of what physicians would later call choreomania, from the Greek words for dance and madness. Similar outbreaks had occurred across Europe since the 14th century. One of the earliest well-documented incidents occurred in 1374, when people in dozens of towns along the Rhine River began dancing uncontrollably. Like the later Strasbourg outbreak, these episodes involved hundreds of people dancing for days on end, many until they collapsed from exhaustion or died. Another notable case occurred in 1237 in the German town of Erfurt, where a group of children reportedly danced continuously all the way to the neighbouring town of Arnstadt, where they collapsed in exhaustion. Many died, and survivors were said to suffer from tremors and twitching for the rest of their lives. For centuries, these bizarre dancing outbreaks were attributed to the curse of a Christian saint, specifically Saint Vitus. This led to the phenomenon being known as Saint Vitus's dance, though this term would later be applied to an unrelated movement disorder, now known as Sydenham's chorea. What makes the 1518 Strasbourg incident so significant is that it's exceptionally well documented. City council minutes, physician notes, sermons, and local chronicles all recorded the strange events in considerable detail, giving us a remarkably clear window into this bizarre episode. When confronted with dozens of people dancing themselves to exhaustion in the streets, the authorities in Strasbourg did what any reasonable 16th century officials would do. They called a meeting. The city council consulted the finest medical minds available. Remember, this was centuries before germ theory, modern psychiatry, or even basic understanding of how the human body functioned. Medicine in 1518 was still largely based on the ancient Greek concept of humours, the belief that 4 bodily fluids needed to be kept in balance for good health. After careful deliberation, the learned physicians of Strasbourg came to a conclusion that might seem utterly baffling to modern ears. The afflicted was suffering from hot blood, and the cure was more dancing. Yes, you heard that correctly. The official prescription for people who couldn't stop dancing was to encourage them to dance more. The logic, twisted as it might seem to us now, was that the dancers needed to exhaust the mysterious malady from their systems. To facilitate this cure, the city council did something extraordinary. They actually hired professional musicians to play music and cleared public spaces for the afflicted to dance in. They also hired strongmen to support the dancers and keep them upright when they inevitably began to collapse from exhaustion. Guild halls were converted into makeshift dance floors. Wooden stages were constructed in public markets and grain halls. The authorities even went so far as to ban regular music and dancing among the healthy population, reserving musicians solely for those suffering from the dancing plague. In effect, the city's solution to a mysterious compulsion to dance was to institutionalize it. Not everyone agreed with this approach, however. Some clergy argued that the dancers were actually possessed by demons or were being punished by Saint Vitus. Their solution was prayer, exorcism, and the displaying of religious relics. Neither approach proved particularly effective. The dancing continued unabated. Since 1518, numerous theories have been proposed to explain this bizarre phenomenon. Let's examine some of the most compelling. Ergot poisoning. One popular theory suggests that the dancers might have consumed grain contaminated with ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and produces compounds similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning, or ergotism, was common in medieval Europe and could cause hallucinations, spasms, and psychosis. The symptoms of ergotism were well known in the Middle Ages as St. Anthony's fire, characterized by burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, and convulsions. However, this theory has significant flaws. Ergotism typically causes painful muscle contractions rather than the coordinated movements described in the dancing plague. Furthermore, ergot poisoning tends to affect scattered individuals who consume the same contaminated grain rather than spreading like a contagion as the dancing plague did. Tarantism. Some historians have drawn parallels between the dancing plague and tarantism, a phenomenon observed primarily in southern Italy, where people believed they had been bitten by a tarantula spider and could cure themselves only by dancing frantically to specific music. This became ritualized into the tarantella dance. Perhaps some similar cultural belief took hold in Strasbourg. The problem with this theory is that there's no evidence such beliefs existed in Alsace, and the dancing in Strasbourg lacked the ritualistic elements and specific music associated with tarantism. What about cults? Could the dancing have been part of some heretical religious cult? The Middle Ages saw numerous fringe religious movements, and some historians have suggested the dancers might have been members of a secret sect engaging in ecstatic worship that spiraled out of control. Again, the evidence doesn't support this. The affected individuals came from all walks of life. Many were well-known community members with no previous history of unusual religious practices, and contemporary accounts clearly describe their dancing as involuntary and distressing. Encephalitis could be an explanation. Some medical historians have proposed that an outbreak of encephalitis, brain inflammation, might explain the symptoms. Certain forms of encephalitis can cause bizarre movements, and altered mental states. While possible, this doesn't fully account for the social pattern of the outbreak or why it specifically manifested as dancing. Mass psychogenic illness. Perhaps the most convincing modern explanation is that the dancing plague was a form of mass psychogenic illness, what used to be called mass hysteria. This occurs when psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms that spread through a population via social contagion. Under this theory, the extreme psychological stress experienced by the populace, famine, disease, hardship, religious anxiety, created a perfect storm for such an outbreak. When Frau Troffea began dancing, others susceptible to the power of suggestion due to their own psychological distress joined in, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. This theory is supported by the fact that the dancing spread in a pattern consistent with social influence rather than biological contagion, affecting predominantly those under severe stress and spreading along social networks. Let's return to our patient zero, the woman who started it all. What do we actually know about Frau Troffea? Unfortunately, very little. Her name suggests she was married, Frau being the German equivalent of Mrs. But we know nothing about her husband, her age, or her social standing. Contemporary chronicles don't even record her first name. What we do know is that she began dancing on July 14th, 1518, and continued without rest for somewhere between 4 and 6 days. Witnesses described her movements as frenzied and uncontrollable. According to accounts, she appeared neither joyful nor conscious of her surroundings, just locked in an endless, exhausting dance. Local authorities initially assumed she was creating a public nuisance and possibly engaging in blasphemy. They had her carted off to a shrine dedicated to St. Vitus, about 30 miles away in the Black Forest, hoping for a miracle cure. What happened to her afterward is lost to history, but by then it was too late. The dancing contagion had already begun to spread. As suddenly and mysteriously as it began, the dancing plague of Strasbourg eventually subsided. By early September 1518, most of the dancers had stopped. Some recovered completely, while others experienced lingering physical and psychological effects. But why did it stop? No definitive cure had been found. The city's strategy of encouraging more dancing had, if anything, likely contributed to the death toll. Some historians suggest that the dancers were eventually taken to a religious shrine, where they prayed for forgiveness. Others propose that as summer turned to autumn and the harvest improved, reducing the immediate threat of starvation, the psychological pressure that had triggered the epidemic began to ease. Perhaps most likely is that the phenomenon simply ran its natural course. Mass psychogenic illnesses typically resolve themselves when the affected individuals are separated from each other, or when the underlying stresses are addressed. Intriguingly, after 1518, Europe never saw another dancing plague of comparable scale. Smaller outbreaks continued sporadically for about another century, but by the mid-1660s, the phenomenon had largely disappeared from European life. The dancing sickness that afflicted Strasbourg in 1518 seems utterly alien to our modern sensibilities. In an age of MRI machines, psychiatric medication, and clinical psychology, surely such bizarre mass phenomena couldn't occur again. Could they? In fact, mass psychogenic illnesses continue to this day, though they typically take forms more aligned with contemporary anxieties and beliefs. Consider these modern examples. In 2011, a mysterious outbreak of hiccups, twitching, and verbal tics spread among teenage girls in Leroy, New York. After exhaustive investigation ruled out environmental toxins, vaccines, and other physical causes, many experts concluded it was a case of mass psychogenic illness. In Malaysia and Singapore in the 1970s and 80s, outbreaks of mass hysteria periodically affected factory workers, particularly young women, who reported seeing spirits and subsequently experienced fainting, screaming, and trembling fits. In 2016, diplomatic staff at the US Embassy in Cuba reported unusual sounds, followed by symptoms including headaches, hearing loss, and cognitive difficulties, dubbed Havana syndrome. While initially thought to be caused by sonic weapons, some medical experts have suggested mass psychogenic illness as a possible explanation for at least some cases. While these modern examples don't involve dancing, they demonstrate that the human mind remains vulnerable to social contagion when under significant stress. The dancing plague of 1518 may have been forgotten by popular culture until relatively recently, but it left a significant mark on medical history. It represented one of the most dramatic examples of how the human mind and body can be affected by social and psychological factors, a concept that wouldn't be fully explored by science until centuries later. The event also provides a fascinating window into the medical practices and social structures of Renaissance Europe. The authorities' response, from hiring musicians to involving the church, reveals much about how 16th century society understood and responded to inexplicable phenomena. For modern medicine, the dancing plague serves as a humbling reminder of the complex interaction between mind and body, and how cultural context shapes the manifestation of psychological distress. What appears as dancing mania in 16th century Germany might emerge as something entirely different in another time and place. Despite nearly 5 centuries of analysis, many questions about the dancing plague remain unanswered. Why dancing specifically? Why did this particular form of expression become the outlet for psychological distress in these communities? Why did it affect some people and not others? If it was indeed a form of mass psychogenic illness, what factors determined who was susceptible? Was there a physiological component that combined with psychological factors? Perhaps a mild ergot poisoning or viral infection that, while insufficient to cause the symptoms alone, created a physical vulnerability that psychological factors could amplify. How much did the authorities' response, creating dedicated spaces for dancing and hiring musicians, contribute to prolonging or worsening the epidemic? These questions may never be fully answered. The dancing plague of 1518 remains partially shrouded in the fog of history, a bizarre episode that reminds us how much about the human mind and body remains mysterious even today. As the last dancers of Strasbourg finally found rest in the late summer of 1518, they left behind a legacy that would perplex and fascinate scholars for centuries. Their strange affliction, this disease that made people dance until they died, serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile the human psyche can be when pushed to its limits by suffering, uncertainty, and fear. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the dancing plague is not how alien it seems, but how recognizably human. In times of extreme stress and social upheaval, the mind can manifest distress in ways that defy rational explanation, but speak to deeply human experiences of desperation, release, and the search for meaning in suffering. The dancers of Strasbourg weren't so different from us. They were simply people responding to unbearable circumstances in the only way their minds and bodies, constrained by the beliefs and pressures of their time, knew how. And so they danced. They danced until they could dance no more. 500 years later, their ghostly steps echo still, a haunting reminder of one of history's strangest episodes and the enduring mystery of the human condition. In the streets of modern Strasbourg, tourists snap photos and go about their day, few aware that beneath their feet lies the stage of one of history's most bizarre performances, a dance macabre that continues to defy complete explanation, challenging our understanding of the complex relationship between mind, body, and society. The music has long since stopped. The dancers are centuries dead. But the mystery? That lingers on, a discordant note in the otherwise orderly progression of medical history. The enigmatic case of the disease that made people dance until they died.